Hello, everybody. Welcome to Dangerous Ideas. I'm leecamp. Special episode today. I've got an incredible guest, one of my favorite guests to have on here, one of the smartest guys I know, and he's the founder and editor of Geopolitical Economy Reports, which is, I don't think I even know all the things it is. It's a website, it's articles, it's a podcast, and everything in between. Please welcome Ben Norton. Hey.
Thanks for having me, Lee. And you're one of you're my favorite comedian. So
thank you. You're my favorite smart guy. So it's tough to know where to begin, but let's begin with this latest U.S.-backed coup attempt in Venezuela. I wanted to get kind of to the deeper issue of why it is that the U.S. has it out for Venezuela in such a kind of unique way. I mean, there's only a few countries in the world that the U.S. seems to go after with the same vitriol regularity as they do Venezuela. And you recently on your podcast spoke about how it's much deeper than just oil reserves, which is what I have often said, but there's a lot more to it.
Yeah, I mean, certainly oil is a factor. I'll talk about that. And we've seen Donald Trump in a 2023 Republican Party rally. He said, "We came so close to taking over Venezuela, we would have gotten all of its oil." So in that comment, I mean, it says a lot. First of all, he has this kind of neo-colonial view, we're going to take over the country. And then he immediately says we could have gotten its oil. So yeah. I'm not disputing that that's important. There's also another clip of John Bolton, who was Donald Trump's neoconservative national security advisor, who oversaw the coup attempt in Venezuela that the Trump administration launched in 2019. And in an interview on Fox News, Bolton said openly that the Trump administration was working with U.S. oil companies that wanted to invest in Venezuela. And why would they want to do that? Well, because Venezuela's oil belongs to the state, belongs to the people of the country through the state-owned company PDVSA. And the previous leftist president, Hugo Chavez, who died in 2013, he had kicked out all of the U.S. oil corporations and made it 100% state-owned. And of course, U.S. companies do want to get access to that oil. So that's certainly a factor. And Venezuela does have the world's largest oil reserves. But as you mentioned, it's not the only factor. In fact, a lot of people don't know that actually the U.S. is the world's largest oil producer. A big reason for that is the shale oil boom in the 2010s. And actually, Obama boasted about this. He was holding a meeting with a bunch of Republicans, and he famously said, when people on Wall Street, when I was in power, they complained. And he says, "Did you look at where your portfolio was when I started and where it was when I left? Just say thank you." And he also boasted of making the U.S. the world's largest oil producer. So the U.S. doesn't necessarily
Shale oil boom was also the flammable tap water boom. So we got to have both.
Yeah, exactly. So, and this is because of fracking, of course. So the devastating communities that have been hurt by fracking in order to make the U.S. the world's largest oil producer. Anyway, the point is that so it's not like the U.S. necessarily needs Venezuela's oil, but there are a few reasons why. First of all, inflation is obviously a very important issue. And we've seen in the US that compared to the rest of the world, actually, inflation in the US hasn't been that bad, but that might be surprising to a lot of people because obviously inflation in the US has been pretty horrible. And for instance, Argentina right now, under this libertarian US-backed leader, Javier Milei, they have over 200% inflation per year. The US inflation after the pandemic peaked around 8 or 9% per year. So imagine, I mean, it's still pretty bad, but in other countries. But anyway, the point is that obviously inflation can be very destabilizing for a government. And Biden, leading up to the midterms in 2022, he actually took a lot of oil out of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve in order to try to bring down oil prices, gas prices before the elections, right? Because obviously one of the biggest contributors to inflation is energy prices, because you need gas to transport goods. If you're going to go buy food at the store, how are you going to get the food there? Well, they transport it on big trucks, and those trucks need oil. So when oil prices go up, food prices tend to go up, right? So this is one of the things that the U.S. is very concerned about. Even though it has a lot of oil and exports oil, it wants to maintain stability in global oil markets. And one of the ways doing that is pressuring other countries or ordering other countries to increase or decrease their oil production, depending on whether you want to increase or decrease the global oil price. We saw this when Joe Biden, he promised during his presidential campaign that he would cut relations with Saudi Arabia over its brutal war crimes in Yemen that the U.S. government under the Obama administration, when he was vice president, supported, and Trump also. And then, of course, when he came into office, he did a 180, and he went to Saudi Arabia and he fist bumped with Prince Mohammed bin Salman, and he begged Saudi Arabia, can you please produce more oil, pump more oil to bring down global oil prices? And Saudi Arabia, which is part of OPEC, said no because they wanted high oil prices. So if the U.S. can overthrow Venezuela's government and U.S. companies can profit from Venezuela's oil, of course, they fund U.S. politicians and they would profit from it. But also it's a way of the U.S. trying to maintain global oil prices, right? Mm-hmm. But obviously, so I talk a lot about oil here, but it's not just about oil, right? It's also significantly geopolitical because Cuba does not have significant oil reserves. And Cuba has been under a U.S. blockade for over 60 years. I mean, the U.S. has constantly, for our entire lifetimes, for the lifetimes of my parents, the U.S. has been trying to overthrow the Cuban government.
They tried to assassinate Fidel hundreds of times, and ultimately they got him with natural causes.
Yeah, 638 times. There's a documentary about this. And they did crazy things like they poisoned cigars and tried to give them to him. They poisoned a swimsuit, like a diving suit, because they knew that he liked to dive, and tried to poison him. They gave him an exploding cigar. And my favorite story, by the way, is that the CIA sent a female agent to Cuba to try to sleep with Fidel, and she fell in love with him and decided not to kill him. So,
really? I didn't know that one.
So anyway, obviously Cuba doesn't have significant oil or natural resources, but it does have a socialist government that is, the threat of a good example, with one of the best health systems in Latin America, with one of the best education systems, despite the fact that it's still a relatively poor country and has been under brutal sanctions and a brutal embargo for over 60 years. And then, of course, there's the geopolitical element. So Venezuela is a very close friend and ally of China, of Russia, of Iran, of many other countries that are part of the global south that are, targeted by the U.S., like Syria, like Zimbabwe, the DPRK, all of these countries that the U.S. is trying to overthrow and destabilize. Venezuela has been closely allied with them. And not just that, starting with the previous president, Hugo Chavez, who came to power in 1999, and he later declared the Bolivarian Revolution, named after Simon Bolivar. Who was Bolivar? He was the Venezuelan general who successfully overthrew Spanish colonialism and freed South America. And so in the Bolivarian Revolution, one of the key goals has been to build a multipolar world. Hugo Chavez was talking about this during his presidential campaign in 1998. Now we hear this word thrown around so much, multipolarity, multipolar world. He was talking about it over 20 years ago. And Venezuela has played an important role in helping to build many of these institutions. So Venezuela, although it's not technically part of BRICS, has always been supportive of BRICS and has participated as an observer in BRICS summits and has applied to join BRICS and likely will join soon. Venezuela, under Chavez and now under Maduro, has been a leader of Latin American regional organizations like the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, the CELAC, which was created as an alternative by Venezuela and Cuba to the US-dominated Organization of American States, which is based in Washington, largely funded by the US. Fidel Castro in Cuba famously referred to the OAS as the Ministry of the Yankee Colonies. So, we see that Venezuela, along with Cuba, played a role in building alternatives so the U.S. cannot try to control Latin America. Venezuela also played a lead role in building an economic organization of Latin American unity, which is called the Bolivarian Alliance, the ALBA. And Venezuela created a currency. This was nearly 15 years ago now. over 15 years ago now, actually. Starting in 2007, 2008, Venezuela created a currency that was called the sucre that was used for trade in Latin America, so they didn't need the US dollar. And for a variety of reasons, it ended up, Chavez died in 2013. There were coups in other countries in Latin America. They lost some left-wing allies, and that project basically died. But it's another example of how prescient Venezuela was, because today de-dollarization has become a very hot topic all around the world. Brazil's president Lula da Silva says he wants to create a Latin American currency. Well, Hugo Chavez did that for a few years. So the point is that obviously oil is a significant factor, but it's not just that, because, if Venezuela were like Saudi Arabia and it had an obedient government that largely followed US orders, Saudi Arabia is now being a little more independent, but for most of Saudi Arabia's history, it just obediently did whatever the US wanted, and the US trained its leaders and its military. And yeah, Saudi Arabia actually have a state-owned company. They're certainly not socialist, but Saudi Aramco owns their oil. But they work with foreign companies and they play ball. And if the US wants them to increase oil production to bring down oil prices, they'll sometimes do it historically. If Venezuela did all of that, then the US would be fine. But of course, Venezuela doesn't do that. Venezuela is completely independent and sovereign. And the Bolivarian revolution started by Chavez, continued by Maduro, is expressly dedicated, they say it, to challenging the US empire and creating a new multipolar world in which countries in Latin America and Africa and Asia have an equal voice and cannot be crushed under the boot of Western corporate monopolies. And obviously, Western corporate monopolies run Western governments, so they're very angry about that.
I had forgotten that about creating a new currency Chavez had, and it seems like these leaders that look into or do create a currency outside the dollar have this odd coincidence of dying. I don't know why that is, but
quick note,
Gaddafi. Because Gaddafi,
so Gaddafi in Libya, he tried to create a Pan-African currency, and also Saddam Hussein. Not that I'm glorifying Saddam Hussein, but Saddam Hussein, he was obviously overthrown by the U.S. and they invaded and destroyed his country and killed over 1 million Iraqis. And Saddam Hussein, before the U.S. invasion, he began selling oil in euros. And at that time, now it sounds goofy because we all know that the European Union today is basically controlled by the US, and European think tanks are publishing articles warning about the vassalization of Europe by the US. But let's not forget that when the EU was created in the late 90s and then into the early 2000s, a lot of people still thought that it would be this kind of independent pole in a multipolar world, that it would not obediently follow the US. Let's not forget that actually France and Germany opposed the U.S. invasion of Iraq, and there was this whole anti-French campaign. You probably remember, like they renamed renamed French fries Freedom Fries and all this nonsense.
Can you imagine a time where France would go against the United States?
Yeah. So at that time, when it said we're not going to sell our oil in dollars, that was actually very scandalous. And now fast forward, in the past few years, not only did Venezuela create this currency, but Venezuela has also been selling its oil in other currencies, especially Chinese yuan. And they did that years ago, not just like the past 2 years with the war in Ukraine. They've been doing this for like almost a decade, selling their oil in other currencies.
Yeah, one of my favorite.
In response to the U.S. sanctions, obviously.
Right. One of my favorite moments was, and this is, I can't remember if it was like the end of Obama administration or maybe the first year of Trump or something, but Pakistan, it was when they first started selling their oil to China, or buying oil from China, or whatever it is, selling in yuan instead of US dollars. And when they did, within days, it was like 3 days or 5 days later, the US added Pakistan to the list of nations that violate religious freedom. And I was like, well, those two don't seem linked at all.
Yeah, exactly.
But
the big difference now is that there's been a lot of interest in that in so many countries in the global south, but it basically got to the breaking point. Now the Washington Post finally, I mean, I'm not one to praise the Washington Post, they are owned by Jeff Bezos, but finally they did this report acknowledging that the US is waging economic war around the world, and they admitted that 60% of countries on earth are under U.S. sanctions. 60%. It's crazy. So, I mean, no, sorry, let me take that back. You can edit this, right?
It's a third of, yeah.
I misspoke.
Yeah. It's a third of all nations that we have
and
sanctions
60%. Yeah, I misspoke. Let me say that. And the Washington Post admitted that 1/3 of all countries on earth are sanctioned by the US, including 60% of poor countries, a majority of poor countries. So obviously, if the US is going to tell everyone around the world they can't use the banking system, which makes it hard to use transactions in dollars, they're going to look for alternatives. So, there was increasing interest, but it got to the breaking point, and especially with a big country like Russia, which is basically too big to sanction, we see that levee has been broken, right? The dam has been broken, and now all of that is flooding out, and so many countries are seeking alternatives to the dollar.
Speaking of U.S. adversaries, the number one on that list now increasingly seems to be China. The U.S. views, the U.S. ruling elite, most of them view, harming or decreasing China's ability to keep growing as the key aspect to maintaining or grasping at U.S. hegemony. I just want you to talk for a bit about China's economy. And, one of the most fascinating things I think people ask a lot about is why China is able to do large infrastructure projects that it seems the United States is completely incapable of. Everything from bullet chains to China built whole hospitals in days during the pandemic. It's just a lot there that people look at and go, why is it China's capable of this and the U.S. is not?
Well, the very simple answer is honestly because the government does it, because they're not relying on private companies to do it that only want to make money, right? Because if a company is going to do something, they're only going to do it if they're motivated by profits to do it. If it's not profitable to make high-speed rail because they're not going to make enough money, if it's not profitable to make public hospitals, they don't do it. So in the US, none of this stuff happens because infrastructure is actually not that profitable unless you can make a big toll booth and charge people money every time they use your road, which increasingly we see across the US, more and more toll booths, right? In China, of course, China has a mixed economy. They do have private companies, but when it comes to infrastructure, it's almost entirely state-owned. And this is something that people really do not understand about China. About 1/3 of China's GDP comes from what are known as state-owned enterprises, SOEs. It means state companies, government-owned companies, and they're concentrated in what's known as the commanding heights of the economy, the most strategic elements of the economy. So for instance, all of the major banks are owned by the state. The huge, massive banks, there's 4 big ones, are the 4 biggest banks on earth by total assets, and they're owned by the state. Furthermore, the big telecommunications companies are owned by the state. So whereas in the US, you have a few monopolies to choose from, Verizon and T-Mobile, whatever. In China, they're all state-owned. And in China, I have a phone plan, and I literally pay about $3, 21 yuan, about $3 per month for 20 gigabytes of data. It's like a joke. It's so much cheaper. Whereas in the US, you have these corporate monopolies and they charge you monopoly rents. They charge you $50, $60 at least a month, right? Furthermore, in China, all of the infrastructure is owned by the state. And the companies that build that infrastructure are state-owned companies. And so, for instance, if you look at the high-speed rail is actually very cheap in China. I think you've gone on it, and it's very good, some of the best in the world. And it's like, if you want to go from Beijing to like Shanghai, for instance, it's like $70 or $80, which is insanely cheap compared to flying or compared to like even Amtrak in the US, considering how far Shanghai and Beijing are from each other.
Yeah, the Amtrak trip from DC to New York, which is supposed to take 4 hours, but often takes 6. It's like $100 usually or something.
Yeah, there you go. So the reality is that the way that China can build all this infrastructure and then maintain it and keep it very cheap is simply because it's done by state-owned companies that are not operating simply to maximize profits. They are operating on behalf of the people, and they also provide larger positive externalities. Economists talk about this idea of externalities. We often know of it in the negative connotation. So a negative externality is pollution, right? So an oil company, they don't care about the pollution. For them, that's an externality. All they care about is their bottom line, right? There are such things as positive externalities. And if the government actually invests in these utilities and public services like infrastructure, like high-speed rail, even if the government loses money, it often has positive externalities in the rest of the economy. So as an example of this, right, I was reading a study in China that was very interesting about how some parts of the high-speed rail actually lose money. But overall, because the entire system is state-owned, it does not lose money. So unlike in Britain, for instance, the UK under Margaret Thatcher, the neoliberal queen, they privatized the railroads, right? Mm-hmm. And however, in some parts of Europe, actually, railroads are still state-owned, like the Netherlands, and they actually have much better results, whereas the privatized railroads have much worse results. However, what happened in the neoliberal era in the UK is they didn't privatize everything. They only privatized the profitable parts of the railroad infrastructure, and they kept the non-profitable parts controlled by the state. So literally, we see an example of the privatization of profits and the socialization of losses. In China, this is true. There are some parts of the railroad, like maintaining the physical infrastructure, because it's so capital intensive and they need to invest a lot, they lose money. But because they found that one of the most profitable parts of the railroad was actually the stations. And why is that? Because in the stations, they rent out a lot of space to businesses and restaurants that charge inflated prices. They charge you twice as much as the food would cost outside of the station, right? Right. So, but this, because the government is renting out those spaces, they are making the profit from renting that out. It's not private. And that profit balances the losses they make in other parts of the system. So China has created a system that creates larger benefits for the rest of the economy and supports other businesses and creates other jobs built around the railroad infrastructure. And even if they lose money in part of it, they don't care, because it's all about building a better economy for the people. Whereas in the US, even if one part of it is not profitable, obviously no company's not going to do it. So the government's not going to do that. And what we end up having is we simply do not have high-speed rail, period. California's been talking about this for decades. It just hasn't happened because it's not profitable, and because the government is not willing to actually, the government could try to do these things and lose some money, but if they wanted to actually make it profitable, they would have to go against these big companies and nationalize some of their property, which they'll never do.
And there used to be a time in the United States where there was at least some of that. Most of our highway system was not built to be profitable, and going to the moon was not meant to be profitable.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. FDR oversaw most of the very good infrastructure production in the US. And now, we have this big debate constantly where people talk about our infrastructure is falling apart. We need to build new infrastructure. Biden always boasts of the so-called bipartisan infrastructure law that he passed. That's the real name. So, there's this big debate, but it's always, we have to have private companies that invest in building this infrastructure, but the state will give them some subsidies. So once again, the only way to get them to do it is the government will give them a bunch of money so it's profitable, but they won't do it on their own. And they talk about public-private partnerships, but there's a really good economist, Mariana Mazzucato, she's very mainstream economist. She's been an advisor for European governments. She's from Italy, but is in the US. And she has a famous book called The Entrepreneurial State. She's not a socialist, she's a mainstream economist. And in this book, she talks about how this myth of the free market, even in the US, is not true. So for instance, we know that in addition to all of the major infrastructure that was built back then, and it's falling apart today, and we can't get good infrastructure, bridges are literally collapsing.
Yep.
Well, it's not just that.
I live in Baltimore. You don't need to open the wound like that, Ben.
Yeah, but it's not just infrastructure. So Mariana Mazzucato showed how most of the modern technology we're using right now comes from the Pentagon. And obviously, it's from the military. I'm not praising the military spending, but it was not private companies that invested in this research. it comes largely from DARPA, which is this, known as the Pentagon's brain. So as an example, if you look at our phone, touchscreen technology comes from the US military. Location technology, GPS technology comes from the
internet,
Navy because they wanted to track their ships.
the
So
internet,
many semiconductors. Go ahead.
the internet.
Yeah, the internet itself. So the government, this is the thing in the US is that we have privatization of profits and socialization of losses. And in China, they have socialization of profits and socialization of losses.
Yeah. I guess I'll just wrap up with this. Where do you have predictions? Where do you see the U.S.-China relationship going? It seems like the U.S. at every step is trying to, push towards basically the same type of shit we have with Russia, proxy war. It seems like the U.S. is trying to create that with China. Of course, all these economic war efforts, tariffs, sanctions. Do you see anything slowing this path?
Realistically, unfortunately not. The reality is that this is completely bipartisan. And, obviously it was Donald Trump that really started the trade war on China and really kicked the new Cold War into high gear. And his neoconservative former CIA director turned Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, gave this infamous speech at the Richard Nixon Library in which he said that it was a mistake to normalize relations with China. And he basically called for overthrowing the Chinese government. So obviously, the Republicans are much more extreme, but the Democrats, they're not as openly extreme, but they basically share the same policy on China. And we've seen that Biden has continued all of Trump's policies. And actually, it was Obama that really started it, and then Trump kicked it into high gear. So Obama and the Hillary Clinton State Department, they declared a so-called pivot to Asia. And as our friend Brian Becker says, when they say pivot to Asia, they mean pivot to war in Asia. So pivot to war on China is what they meant. Yeah. And specifically, the whole idea was, okay, we're going to wrap up the wars in the so-called Middle East, which is West Asia, and we're going to move all those troops to East Asia off the coast of China, and we're going to plan for a war. And we've seen even some U.S. generals threatening war, saying that they think we're going to be in war as soon as 2025. I think that's, I think that's too soon. I think it's part of like this whole Mad Men strategy where they're trying to scare people in China. But unfortunately, both political parties have made it clear that they're hell-bent on this. And it's because, as Antony Blinken famously said in a speech where he called for shaping the strategic environment around China. That's the language he used. He means containment, a new Cold War and containment policy. And in that speech, he famously said, Russia's a short-term threat, but China is the biggest so-called long-term threat because China not only has the will, but the means to transform the global system. China is the world's largest economy when its GDP is measured at purchasing power parity, which is the best way to measure the size of the economy, instead of just converting everything to dollars, which makes the US economy look bigger than it actually is. China has the world's largest military now. China has 1.4 billion people. China now has some of the best universities in the world. It has some of the best scientists and engineers. It's advancing in high-tech technology, like, semiconductors. It's catching up very quickly, like also electric vehicles and solar panels, which is why the US is tariffing and banning all of these technologies. And really, the US goal was admitted by the US Commerce Secretary, Gina Raimondo. She said openly that the US goal is to prevent China from innovating. And she said that we must work with Europe to prevent China from developing. And then she also later said, we will do everything we can to prevent China from getting access to the most advanced technology. And this is the Democratic administration. If Trump comes back, it's going to be a whole new level of extreme aggression against China. So unfortunately, we know that the warmongers in Washington, from both parties, are always looking for a convenient scapegoat to blame for all their problems. So they don't blame, Purdue Pharma and the Sackler family for the opioid epidemic in the US, which was caused by these pharmaceutical corporations that were profiting from giving people these drugs they didn't need. Instead of blaming them, they blame China. Instead of talking about, the horrific problems of gun violence and all this stuff, they blame China for everything. You know, so the reality is that it's too convenient of a scapegoat. It's also for the Republicans, it's like an existential threat because China is an atheistic country, they're non-white, they're communist. So then they can say, this is the perfect boogeyman, right? That the Republicans want to fight against. The Democrats can say that they're violating so-called democracy and human rights and all this nonsense rhetoric that they use as if the US were a democracy, which it's not. So unfortunately, it's like the perfect enemy that the ruling class in Washington want to justify all of the policies that they implement that are bad for the people of the US, but are good for the military industrial complex. And there basically are no incentives pushing politicians in the US to not want more aggression against China, because all of the big companies that fund their campaigns, all of the big corporations are on board with this.
Yeah, I think that's right. It's also a lot easier to keep people under control when you have a big bad monster out there that's going to get them. Thank you so much, Ben, for taking the time. What's the best way for people to follow all your work?
Well, thanks for having me, Lee. People can go to geopoliticaleconomy.com and find links to everything. And of course, I'm very active on YouTube. And I also have my videos backed up on Rumble and Odyssey. So yeah, people can just, if you look up Geopolitical Economy Report, you can find it on all platforms. And Lee, keep up the great work. I always love watching your videos, and thanks for helping keep things funny and make us laugh and not all go crazy from how insane the world is.
I'm doing my best to not go crazy myself, but thank you so much, Ben. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. Keep up the fight.
My pleasure.
All right, Ben Norton, Geopolitical Economy Report. Check it out if you haven't already. I'll be back with you very soon. And sorry, this had to be a pre-taped show. I am doing some traveling, so I'm trying to still bring you guys awesome shows anyway. Make sure you click subscribe if you haven't already, and the bell icon, and keep fighting.